समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
If you look at the Cut the Clutter playlist over the past 3 years, but particularly over the past many months, you will see that the subject that has dominated Cut the Clutter episodes is West Asia, Middle East. You can choose what you prefer. Basically, this conflict zone and also the energy rich zone which affects everybody's life in the world because it influences what happens to our economic fortunes, to inflation, to our exchange rates, everything, and also overall security, remittances in case of India, millions of Indians who are working there. In fact, more than 10 million Indians who are working there. All of that is important. It's also a kind of locus of many ongoing wars. In this case, however, it's not really war between two major international powers, two major superpowers, or a superpower and a deputy superpower, or between America and Russia or America and China. China, if anything, is out of it. However, the same names keep surfacing, the same nations, and some of the same conflicts persist. So we need to understand where we've come from and what has brought us here. Now, as I start with this, I will tell you a little secret about Cut the Clutter. One little secret about Cut the Clutter is that, and you can check it out with our playlist, we almost never, in fact, there is a rule not to use the word history in either the headlines or the thumbnail that you see on the video. So in what we call as the elements of the video, we don't use the word history. Why? Because history gives the sense that we are talking about the past. It's something that you can Google, you can find out, or maybe you can ask one of these AI tools to help you with. So what is history? History is not something that needs to be decluttered now. The fact, however, is that unless we understand where we've come from in the West Asian zone today, we cannot understand what's going on. And that's why at some point I figured that we will have to look at some of these facts and dates. Remember your history textbook and your history class. What is it that we hated most of all? At least in our era, you had to remember the dates of the first battle of Panipat, second battle of Panipat, third battle of Panipat, battle of Plassey, like that. You had to, or when was one Mughal Basha born, when did he die, or any of the other rulers. So these dates used to be a bugbear. However, in this case, if you want to understand, because the West Asia story is not over. As I'm talking, the pre-funeral mass mourning for Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is going on, and then you'll be watching visuals of the funeral at which delegations have gone from all over the world, including from India, led by Lieutenant General Atta Hasnain, currently the governor of Bihar. Now, with all of this at the top of your mind, it's important, even necessary, to step back a little bit, take a deep breath, and remember some years, because those will tell us what happened when. So the years I'll tell you about is 1914 to 18. That is when the First World War took place. Then we come to July 15 to March 1916. That is when the storied McMahon-Hussein letters were exchanged. I will tell you more as we go ahead. Then come to 1916. That's when the Sykes-Picot Agreement was signed. Once again, I will tell you the details as we go on. Then 1917, that's when the Balfour Declaration became public. And step backwards a little bit, that's when Ibn Saud, who became King Saud ultimately and the founder of Saudi Arabia, he started putting together his group of Ikhwan. Ikhwan is brotherhood, so it was like a Muslim brotherhood. That he started that process in 1912. That was very important. Then we come to 1925. 1925 is when he came to control Mecca, and then we can jump to 1932. 1932 is when the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is proclaimed. Then early in 1944, when FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, talks to the British ambassador and gives him the message about sharing the oil wealth of this region, because oil was found in the Middle East or in West Asia in 1927, first in Kirkuk in what's now in Iraq. Although if you go into deep detail, the first find was 1908 in Zagros Basin in Iran, and that was by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which is kind of precursor to what is today's BP or British Petroleum. The Kurdish zone of Iraq, then 1932 in Bahrain, and 1938 in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. So the structure of the Middle East as we see today, these national boundaries as we see today, this region was under colonial occupation in different ways. Until World War I, it was under the Ottoman occupation. You can call it occupation, or maybe if you want to be a Puritan, you will say it was not an occupation, for it was just a large Islamic state or caliphate where the Ottoman ruler was the formal caliph. Nevertheless, all this region was under the Ottoman Empire. Then came the British power, or the power of the victors of the First World War, that is the British and the French. So they divided it up. And then at some point, they decided to leave the place and create these countries and divide it among various power groups. And that is when they drew these straight lines on the map. Straight lines on the map. This was done without any consideration to whether they were separating families or tribes, or they were keeping in mind any geographical features. In many cases, it was just lines in the sand. And that's how these nations were created. Once again, for ease of understanding, West Asia or the Middle East as we see today, it came into being between the First and the Second World War. And what we see today is a consequence of the two world wars. What happened? After the First World War, 1914 to 2008, and 1914 to 1918, after that, the Ottoman Empire was defeated. In the war, Ottoman Empire was on the wrong side. Wrong side means the losing side. Many of us might not remember that in the First World War, Russia and Japan were actually on the winning side. It's just that the Russians pulled out in 1917 because of the revolution there. Otherwise, the Russians and the Japanese were fighting alongside the British and the Americans and the French against the Germans and the Ottoman power, and in Bulgaria and some of the others who lost out. The Ottomans lost their empire. As the Ottomans lost their empire, the Ottoman king was still there. However, in the course of time, Turkey was taken over by Kemal Atatürk. Kemal Atatürk took Turkey, became its ruler and dictator, and abolished the caliphate. The Ottomans formally ceased to exist. As the Ottomans ceased to exist, all of this region that they controlled was up for grabs. Now what happened? The British, the French, the likely winners of First World War had a good idea that they were going to win. That's why 1916 itself, they had started planning the future of this region. But what existed in this region were the holiest places of the Muslims, the big mosques, of the grand mosques of Makkah and Medina. Until then, the Ottomans were the guardians or the custodians of these mosques. Islam was a very important faith with a lot of followers all over the world, in this region and elsewhere, and also in the British Empire, particularly in India then, because India then was, the whole subcontinent was one nation. And just as today, almost 40% of the world's Muslims live in India, even at that time, a large number of a very large percentage, between 30 and 40% of the world's Muslims lived in India. That was then United India, remember. So the British, the others were concerned about what will happen to these holy places once changes took place here. Also, this is the time when the thought of creating an independent state for the Jews surfaced. Those are the dates that I'm telling you about.
And the decline of the British Empire had a long tail after the Second World War. At the longest end of it were the regions in the Middle East. And that's how 1961, Qatar got its independence. 1971, Bahrain, Kuwait, and UAE. In fact, coincidentally, Bahrain got its independence on August 15, 1971, so has the same Independence Day as us. UAE, the various emirates were called trucial states. Now, what's the meaning of trucial states? That's because these states came into being as a result of treaties or truces in the late 19th century. And all of them then came together and became the UAE. At one point, there was talk that Qatar may also join them, but that did not happen. That's the story for another day.
And now I will tell you of the buzz it had in India and the long-lasting impact it had in India, leading in fact to the Pakistan movement and to the partition of India as well. This was such an epochal period. So once again, we go back to World War I, 1914 to 1918. The Russians pull out because of their revolution. But by that time, you know that the British, French, Russian, US side, British, French, Russian, American side is winning the World War, and the other side, the Central Powers, which were led by Germany, but included the Ottomans, they were losing. So as they lost out, then the League of Nations came in, and all other division of territories took place in that war. To fight the Ottomans, because Ottomans controlled the Arab lands. Remember, Turkey or Ottoman Empire, the center of the Ottoman Empire was inhabited by Turks, ethnically different from Arabs. The holy mosques were in the Arab land. So it is the Arab populations and their leaders who thought that they could fight the Ottomans and free themselves. They could get a nation or some kind of national entity of their own. And that's when Hussein ibn Ali was the Sharif of Makkah, like the head Mufti of Makkah. He led an Arab revolt. Against the Ottoman Empire. So it became Arab versus Turk, an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire to free up these Arabic lands from Ottoman control, and there he became a partner with the British, the French, and the Americans between the eventual victors of World War I. He was given a promise that once the war is won and Ottomans are defeated, he will be given an Arab nation. That was a promise. That is one of our important dates between July 1915 to March 1916. In those months, there were a bunch of letters exchanged between the Sharif of Makkah, Hussein ibn Ali, who was leading this Arab revolt against the Ottomans, and Sir Henry McMahon. Sir Henry McMahon, the same McMahon after whom the McMahon line is named, our border with China, the same Henry McMahon was now the British High Commissioner to Cairo. Why was he called High Commissioner? Because High Commissioner usually is the description used for ambassadors that Commonwealth countries have in each other's capitals. The British ambassador to India is a High Commissioner, Indian ambassador to Britain is a High Commissioner, Indian ambassador to Canada is a High Commissioner, and so on and so forth. But in this case, British envoy to Cairo was called a High Commissioner because Egypt was still a British protectorate. Remember, long back, Napoleon had tried to conquer Egypt. The British had defeated him, and since then the British had pretty much controlled Egypt. So Egypt was a British protectorate. There were letters exchanged between Sir Henry McMahon and Hussein ibn Ali, where an Arab nation was promised after the defeat of the Ottomans. So that is one part of the story. Sykes-Picot, so 1916, that's why 1916 is important, because Sykes-Picot Agreement came out, that was signed then, because France and Britain decided how to divide these territories. The Americans had not yet realized the value of these territories. That happened much later. We'll come to that. France and Britain divided this up. Those two, because they knew that they thought they were going to win this war, they were on their way to winning this war, they figured out what to do with the Arab lands, mostly Arab lands or essentially former Ottoman possessions once the war is over. So they decided to divide up the region between them as their own mandates or areas whose fate they will determine going ahead. And these included all of the Ottoman territories, including Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine. These got divided broadly between British and French mandate. At the same time, what is Lebanon, Syria to some extent, these were French mandate. This was at a time when pan-Arabism was also rising, because Arabs in these various nations were looking at themselves also as one ethnicity, and they were also looking at liberation from Ottoman control. This is where different ideologies came into play. There was a Shia and Sunni ideology, because Sunnis were the Arabs, most of them were Sunnis. Shias were the Iranians, Shias were the Iranians or the Persians. Ethnicities came into play, Arabs on this side, Turks, and then Persians in Iran. And in this division and in this mess, some Muslim minorities, they were ethnic minorities, Kurds and the Druze, for example, they sort of got left out. Now, 1917, as the Sykes-Picot Agreement becomes visible and everybody in the region knows they are going to be divided up between the British and the French, something else comes out, and that is called the Balfour Declaration. Balfour Declaration is actually a letter exchanged between Sir Arthur James Balfour, who is the British Foreign Secretary, and a big banker, global banker, businessman, Jewish leading light, Lionel Walter Rothschild, in which Balfour promises a nation for the Jews. Remember, this is way before the Holocaust and way before the Second World War. So this promise was made then. However, the larger migration of Jews to this territory came as a consequence of the Holocaust and excesses all over Europe during the Second World War. Now, while all of this is going on, other stuff is happening in the Arab world. First of all, there is a reaction that this Jewish state will be created. But besides that, the Arabs have issues of their own. What are these? Hussein ibn Ali, he thinks that because the war has now been won, he should become the ruler of all of the Arab lands. That doesn't happen. The British and the French do not want that. But besides that, he has an internal challenge also. 1912, I told you, Hussein ibn Saud, he started putting together his group called Ikhwan, which means Brotherhood of Islam. And he wanted control of these regions. So he moved on Makkah. By 1925, he had taken, or Ikhwanis had taken control of Makkah. They took control of Makkah and they surrounded Medina. By 1926, in the Grand Mosque of Makkah, Ibn Saud was pronounced king. He was pronounced king there. And then in 1932, he was able to unite the large regions of Najd and Hijaz, and found the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That's why Saudi Arabia, because King Saud. Now, Hussein ibn Ali, he thought he was more entitled. He had a greater claim to rule this entire region because he claimed ancestry or descent from the clan of the Holy Prophet. He was from the Hashim clan, or a Hashemite, because the Prophet himself came from the Hashim clan. Hashims are a sub-clan, let me say, of the Quraysh, larger Quraysh tribe. Hussein ibn Ali thought that because of that, he should get to rule what became Saudi Arabia. But he did not get that. He was pushed out. In the course of time, the British created a territory for his descendants, his family and his descendants and his dynasty. And thereby came into being the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. So Jordan's rulers are even now called Hashemites. In fact, Jordan's name is Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And that's how the British carried out divide and rule in this region. And that's how the straight line borders were drawn. Even today, Jordan continues to be a very loyal ally of the British and the West. In fact, much more loyal and much more committed and much more trusted than Saudi Arabia at any point of time. Now, some of that began to change in 1927 also. There were many things going on at the same time. I told you the region came into being, these nations came into being between the two world wars. As a consequence of the two world wars, the first one led to the defeat of the Ottomans and freeing up of all these territories. The second one led to the complete weakening of the colonial powers, particularly the Brits, and that's when they decided to let these territories go because they were not able to manage these. In the middle of all this, while all this is going on, a big curse visits this region. Now you can call it a curse, you can call it a blessing. In many ways, it's turned out to be a curse. In fact, this itself, in a way, contributed to the coining of the expression, the resource curse. In 1927, for the first time, oil was discovered, as I told you, in Kirkuk, in Kurdish, Iraq, 1932 in Bahrain, 1938 in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Now, when the Second World War ended and the British knew that they were going to go away from here, the next thing to remember is 1920. 1920 is when the Treaty of Sèvres was signed. Sèvres is a place 10 kilometers outside of Paris. Sèvres is a suburb 10 kilometers outside of Paris. That's when the French and the British decided to take out all non-Turkish territories that Ottomans had controlled. That finished the Ottoman Empire. In fact, they also took away some regions which were in original Turkish control and gave them away, for example, to Greece. That's the reason Turkey and Greece remain at odds, even though both are members of NATO. By the time the Second World War was ending, everybody knew that there was oil in this region and oil had value. Americans had a lot of oil of their own, but they realized that oil here was very cheap. It was very easy to dig out. It was very shallow, and you could use it, and their companies could come and exploit it. J. Paul Getty first sent his explorers there. Then Franklin D. Roosevelt told the British ambassador that, look, we need to divide up these regions, oil, between ourselves. So there is a quote, it's recorded in history. This is a conversation in 1944 between Franklin D. Roosevelt and Edward Wood, or Earl of Halifax, who was the British ambassador to the US, where Roosevelt said, Persian oil is yours. Persian means Iranian. Persian oil is yours. We share the oil of Iraq and Kuwait. Saudi Arabian oil is all ours. And that is when the final division of the Middle East took place between the big Western powers, and that division was defined by oil. Now, this is when Cold War was also beginning. The Soviet Union, the Soviet power, was also looking at the world in its own way, and they saw themselves as rivals of the American-led Western power. And that is when, in the Middle East, the first left group came in. So the Ba'ath Party came into being in 1947-48. The first country that took over was Syria in 1963. 1968, the Ba'ath Party took Iraq also. This was a socialist leftist party, not at all Islamist. So within the Arab world, these countries with large populations went another way. And in the course of time, although Iraq was earlier an American ally, that's where the Baghdad Pact was signed, which the Pakistanis also joined, they broke away and they became allies and clients of the Soviet Union. They became allies and clients of the Soviet Union. In fact, at one point, Egypt and Syria also became one nation. They called themselves United Arab Republic. Remember that conversation where Roosevelt had said, who will own which oil? And I told you that by late 1940s, Soviet Union and the left ideology had also begun to rise there. One of those leaders, Mohammad Mossadegh, got elected in Iran in early 1950s. He was left of center, anti-West, and he nationalized. He started out by nationalizing oil companies. Remember, Persian oil was meant to be British in that Roosevelt formula. And that is when MI6, the British Secret Service, and the CIA carried out an operation called Operation Ajax, which led to the fall of Mossadegh and then the elevation of the Shah as a full-fledged dictatorial ruler of Iran, who worked totally in partnership with the Western powers until he was thrown out in the 1978-79 revolution. Once again, as a result of the Shah being there until 1978-79, Iran was a key ally of the West in the region. So the West had a situation where almost the entire region which had oil reserves were their allies. That's why you had a situation where almost all of the region that had oil, that is Persia, most of the Arab countries, they were allies, or I would say the protectorates of the Western powers, except Iraq, which had gone the way of the left. In the middle of all this, 1945 onwards, the state of Israel became a reality, and the Palestinian issue by the mid-60s became a rallying cry, not so much for the Arab power. It did not become a rallying cry for Saudi Arabia or for Qatar or for Kuwait. It became a rallying cry for those Arab states which were left of center or Soviet aligned. These included significantly Egypt and Syria, which were Israel's neighbors, but also Iraq, which was just some distance away. And now I had mentioned to you early on that I will also take you through what impact it had on India and how ultimately it contributed in many ways to India's partition as well, although that is not a straight line story. There is clutter in that story as well. In 1920, when the Treaty of Sevres divided up the Ottoman Empire, basically Ottoman Empire was dismembered, worries spread that the Ottoman ruler, who was the Khalifa or Caliph of the entire Islamic world, or the Ummah, and also custodian of the holy places, he will lose control of the Ummah and the holy places, and God knows who will control the holy places. That made conservative Muslims very insecure, and in this subcontinent, that led to a movement called Khilafat movement. Now, I remember when I first read Khilafat movement, maybe as a child in school, I thought Khilafat means opposition, but no, Khilafat doesn't mean opposition. Khilafat is sort of the Indianized way of saying caliphate. This was a movement to conserve the caliphate, and this was launched by two Ali brothers, Muhammad Ali Jauhar and Shaukat Ali, and the idea was to pressure the British to restore the caliph of Islam. That okay, you want to rule Turkey, you can rule Turkey. You want to rule Arab world, you can find your own ways of doing it, but restore the Caliph of Islam. So the Caliph will also be the custodian of the holy places. With this, All India Khilafat Committee was set up in Mumbai in 1919. That's the year of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre on 17th of October, which was also observed as the Khilafat Day. Gandhi joined the Khilafat movement. Gandhi got the Congress to join the Khilafat movement because he thought this was a way of getting the Hindus and Muslims to come together, because if Hindus were seen to be helping the Muslims in this cause, then that will bring them together. That was one of Gandhi's biggest mistakes. Just as well that it did not last that long, because by 1922, Kamal Ataturk had taken over. He abolished the caliphate himself, so that was over. The British and the Western powers, meanwhile, were in the process of creating the Saudi power and installing the king of Saudi Arabia as the custodian of the holy mosques. Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman ruler, just disappeared, and nobody heard of him and his family very much after that. Completely went into oblivion. Gandhi suspended also his non-cooperation movement, because one of Gandhi's motives also was that if he gets the Congress to support the Khilafat movement, he will get the Muslims to support the non-cooperation movement. However, he suspended the non-cooperation movement after violence in Chauri Chaura. In the same period, other things happened. 1921, the Mopla revolt took place, which was supposedly, it started as a peasant revolt, but took a very vicious communal color, anti-Hindu color very soon, and that got the Hindus completely disillusioned with any idea of supporting the Khilafat movement. Many of the leaders of the Khilafat movement, however, went on to become the founders of the idea of Pakistan. Muhammad Ali Jauhar died in 1931, but before that, in 1930, at the Round Table Conference, he had said, I will not come back to a slave country. He had begun to think of a Muslim nation already, and other leaders like Chaudhry Khaliquzzaman and Maulana Hasrat Mohani, they became also key figures in the Pakistan movement. In fact, Maulana Hasrat Mohani seconded the Pakistan resolution in 1940. Ironically, he was among those who signed for Poon Swaraj in the Congress session of 1921. I told you, however, that there are complexities here and there is clutter here. What more can you see or imagine by way of clutter than the fact that Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had opposed the Khilafat movement. And why did he oppose it? He opposed it, number one, because he did not like religious politics. He believed in constitutionalism, and he warned Gandhi that participating in the Khilafat movement was not add to Hindu-Muslim harmony. This will actually endanger Hindu-Muslim harmony. He also believed that Khilafat or Caliphate was a foreign geopolitical issue to do with Turkey. Indian Muslims had nothing to do with this dying empire. Indian Muslims should focus on themselves, and he said also that the kind of hyper-emotionalism that was behind the Khilafat movement will lead to the marginalization of moderate Muslims. So because there are stories within stories within stories, and it's the essence of cut the clutter that we try and simplify these for you, let me conclude this about Jinnah by saying, कहाँ से कहाँ पहुँच गए, कहाँ थे और कहाँ चले गए.